Welcome to today's broadcast of North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of NIC television students, and your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Today we start a 4-week series with the people of Spokane, and we're calling this series Understanding the Cultural and Ethnic Diversity of the Spokane Area People. This series of programs has emerged out of a number of discussions about Spokane County and our people in this area. We want to talk during this 4 weeks about the progress and benefits of having a diverse society and all the progress that's been made in human rights in past years. But also we equally want to talk about the problems that we face, not only here but across the country, and our guests will do that during this 4-week series. As I introduce the program, the first week will be entitled Public Policy and Human Rights. In the second week, we're going to talk with area human rights groups, and we're going to discuss both the progress and the problems that week. The third week will be a discussion with victims of racial and religious prejudice. And then during our fourth week, we will talk to the people of Spokane, a rather large number of people talking about making a difference in our community. To start the first week, it's my pleasure to welcome to the program two guests. First of all, to my far left is Carol Gregory, and we're happy to have her over from Olympia, where she serves as the assistant to Governor Gardner for Citizen Relations. Carol, welcome to the program. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
I'm also equally happy to have on our program Bob Delwo, who is a member of the Spokane City Council. And Bob, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
And I'm very happy to have regular panelist, State Senator Mary Lou Reed from the state of Idaho, who will join in the 4-week series to ask questions of our guests. And I have a guest panelist, former state representative in Idaho, Jeanne Gibbons. And in introducing her, I must say many thanks to Jeanne. She is serving an internship with Whitworth College in Communications, and she has been the real person that has done the most to put this together. And Jeanne, we thank you for all your hours of work and look forward to the 4-week series.
You're welcome.
I will ask Senator Reed to commence the questioning.
Thank you, Tony, and I want to thank you and Jeanne, too, for the chance to be here. Carol, let me ask the first question to you. You're here representing Governor Gardner, and in the 60s, we looked to the federal government to establish civil rights legislation and policy. But now in the 80s, the states are picking up on it, and we're looking to the states to come up with solutions. What would you say are the outstanding things that Washington is doing now to pick up on the development of a state policy?
There are several areas of concentration right now in the state of Washington as it relates to civil rights, public policy in the area of civil rights. In the past 4 years, we've addressed the issue of discrimination, expanded the groups that are covered by the anti-discrimination executive order that has been issued by the governor. We have worked extensively in the area of AIDS and AIDS policy and civil rights as it relates to AIDS victims. We also have recently, the governor has recently issued a sexual harassment executive order that affects all state employees. And finally, right now, our legislature is addressing the issue of malicious harassment. And this comes out of a sad set of circumstances that occurred in our state, in which there were cross burnings on the lawn of a family, and the issue went to court, and the first person who was tried for burning the crosses was not convicted through some very strange set of circumstances. This outraged the community as well as the legislature, and there is a malicious harassment bill going through our legislature right now expanding what malicious harassment means, so that a cross burning is in fact against the law in our state if it either injures a person, their property, or causes them to fear injury of either their person or their property. And in addition to that, it speaks to the education of judges and the legal system, which we think is a very important part of any kind of civil rights legislation.
Now that sounds really very forward-looking. How is the legislature trying to define fear? I think this is something that we run into where fear is actually the target of, that's what we want to get at to make sure that our citizens are not living in fear. On the other hand, from a legal standpoint, I think this is a very subjective thing to define. How are they addressing that?
They're looking rather specifically at activities that are traditionally viewed as harassment and those kinds of activities which cause fear in individuals. An instance would be a cross burning, and the legislature speaks specifically to that. Another instance would be any kind of verbal attack that causes someone to fear for their life. Often that depends on the verbiage that's being used. Painting swastikas, for instance, would be something covered under this legislation.
And they're attempting to make this criminal act.
Yes.
Is there any, are they addressing the civil remedies issue?
This is a criminal Class C. I'm not an attorney. I'd have to check that in the law, but yes, it is a felony.
Let's ask our attorney if he wants to comment on this kind of legislation.
Well, the legislation must be very, very fair first in its wording so that it deals fairly with all groups of people. And to some extent, the legislation places a burden on local law enforcement on the cities, where we have to shape up and conform to its principles and policies. And that, of course, the city of Spokane has sought to do. I might say it's a privilege to sit on this panel with former state representative Jeanne Gibbons. As she knows, I've represented her tribe as attorney for 35 years, I think, since she was a small child. And the Coeur d'Alene tribe has taught me a whole lot about human relations, particularly with regards to the relations of Native Americans with the city and with the county and with law enforcement and so forth. And as it's been a very educational thing for me. And coming onto the city council, then of course I found that there was a big gap in what I considered the fairness in the administration of city and state programs within the city of Spokane. For instance, practically no minorities employed by the city of Spokane or the county, none whatever by the police and the fire department, a token one or two, and I might say very few women employed by the city or the county. And that, like most inland cities, the city of Spokane and the county being totally unaware of how they appeared to, in this case, the Native Americans and also to the Black and the Hispanic community, in which there is actually an atmosphere and an environment of discrimination that I believe the city of Spokane was unaware of.
Jeanne Gibbons.
Thank you, Tony. Bob, it's also good to see you, and Carol, thank you for coming over from Olympia. What do you think? How do you define the role of an elected official to carry out a human rights agenda? And I'll start with you, Bob. You've been on the city council for some time now. And how do you perform that in carrying out your duty?
You have to first look at the problem of the elected official, particularly the local city councilman or county commissioner. They're kind of like members of the board of a large corporation that can be so easily taken up with the minutiae of running the city or running the county that they become unaware actually of the very thing they're supposed to protect, the policy of, in this case, of non-discrimination. So I think the role of the elective officer, in this case councilman or county commissioner, is to monitor the city and county administrations to make sure that they're fairly administered on so that there is not discrimination or segregation or harassment or anything of that kind. For the most part, you find that there are sufficient laws already on the books, but they're being ignored or countermanded, and with a kind of a counter unwritten policy. So I think it's more the role of the elected official is one of alertness to abuses, that then he should step in and take care of those.
Bob, what are your mechanisms to oversee affirmative action, to carry out an affirmative action policy for the city of Spokane? How do you carry out that function?
Well, in my own personal case, literally to walk down and talk to the office and see what help the city can be and the city council in accomplishing the objectives of affirmative action. I think we found that to some extent that affirmative action was really being ignored, that it was a kind of a tokenism. And therefore, I thought that the role of the elective city official, in this case my own self, was to walk down and see how effective it was and what assistance the city council could be in enforcing affirmative action.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Carol, in the governor's office?
I would say that probably the most important responsibility of an elected official is to provide leadership. And in this arena, it can be done in a variety of ways. It can be done by overt action, which, as Bob just indicated, actually being on site and seeing what's going on. It can be recommending legislation. It can be setting an example right within your own office and staff as to what your expectations are for state government. And it's also a responsibility of an elected official to be willing to take risks. And taking risks means attacking some issues and or making some decisions that may not be politically popular but are right. And the governor has, in particular, been willing to do that in the area of sexual preference. Our anti-discrimination executive order that had been issued by previous governors did not have sexual orientation in it. The governor took the risk, which was a political risk, of reissuing that order to include that because he felt that that was a group of people within state government who were potentially and or were probably being discriminated against but had no protection under the law, and therefore he took it upon himself to include that group. I think those are the kinds of things that an elected leader needs to do in order to fulfill their responsibility when elected.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
We've heard so much about violence in all parts of the United States, and we have not been able to escape that in the Northwest. And I'm speaking particularly of the activities of some what we call hate groups in this country, and the most recent example has been publicity of skinheads. And our viewers may not be aware of the fact that the Northwest states have been moving, and I think in a very progressive way, to address this problem. We have some people on this panel that have been very active in that kind of legislation in Idaho. In fact, in Idaho we have my question is a rather long one, but I think it's important to get this out before the people. We have a package that includes what you're talking about, Carol. In Idaho, Washington, and Oregon, what we call the anti-malicious harassment law, and it has both criminal and civil provisions to protect victims that we have in our society from these hate groups. We also have in Idaho what we call Domestic Control Act, or prohibiting paramilitary training by hate groups. And we just passed Representative Gibbons' bill that Senator Reed carried this year called Hate Crimes Reporting. Now Oregon and Washington appear to be ready to put that on the books, that we have some kind of statistics from law enforcement to indicate the magnitude of the problem. And I can also report that Montana has just passed the anti-malicious harassment law. So there is a lot of activity in that field here in the Northwest, and my contention is that this is not the place to move if you're involved in hate activity, because of what Senator Reed has said, that we are really dealing with that on the state and local level. With that background, my question is, what else can we do? I really think that it's so obvious from the statistics what's happening in Portland and Seattle, and violence is out there. And as Bob has indicated, legislation is there on the books, but state leaders and city leaders and county leaders and outside of public officials, community leaders, what can you share with our viewers today? Particularly, I'm thinking of the person who's become a victim and may have not reported that. Please give them some information on how we make sure that there's a very, very full enforcement of that legislation so that these crimes will decrease instead of increase. Bob, would you like to go first?
Well, we have to be positive in the sense of showing that we as a community find this type of activity, hate group activity, malicious harassment, as being absolutely repugnant to our society and our policies as a city and county government and as a state government. And we cannot afford to allow there to be the slightest indication of tolerance of that kind of activity. And I'm afraid there has been an indication in some communities that activities like this can go on and it won't be prosecuted. I think that Spokane has, particularly under our present chief of police, acted very aggressively to intercept and prevent this type of activity. And we, of course, had the recent prosecution of one of the skinheads that, or plural, skinheads that beat up a minority black person almost to death. And of course, down in Portland, the actual death that occurred, in which there was an aggressive policy of prosecution. I think that has to be carried on so that the message is given that we as a community just will not just find that kind of thing not only tolerant but absolutely abhorrent. And of course, the city of Spokane did join the Northwest Coalition against malicious harassment. We did quickly pass a resolution supporting Kootenai County and its activities. We had this event that occurred a couple years ago where the Aryans came in and wanted to have a meeting in Riverfront Park, and we found as a constitutional matter we had to allow them to do it, but it was pretty much isolated. There wasn't anybody showed up to watch it or to hear it. So we simply must be constantly alert against that, and I hope we can step up that alertness. I think we've done fairly well to date.
Thank you. Carol, what else can be done at the state level? I know you've been addressing the West Coast and some of the problems. I assume the governor's office works closely with the Attorney General and others.
Yes, although I guess I would respond somewhat in the same way Bob did. I think that the role of particularly elected leader is to help mold public opinion and to help clarify through strong statements the repugnance of this kind of behavior, and to assist wherever that elected official can through their particular office in serving notice that this is an inappropriate behavior and won't be tolerated. In addition to that, then you look at departments within state government that can in fact assist with enforcement, both on the legal side, and then also when you talk about the victim, how can we as state government provide some assistance to the victim if in fact it's a discriminatory act. And I think making that kind of information available to citizens at the same time you are molding public opinion is a critical part of that, through the State Human Rights Commission or whatever vehicle seems appropriate.
When criminal action takes place, of course, the police are notified and become involved in the prosecutor, and Mr. Brock has been very successful with the prosecution of the skinheads that were involved with the knifing here. But I just want to get this point across that the Washington Human Rights Commission, although has its main office in Olympia, they are regional offices, and here in Spokane there is an office that's open, I assume, 5 days a week?
8 to 5. It's in the telephone book, and if anyone is having difficulty reaching them, they can certainly call the governor's office here in Olympia, or excuse me, here in Spokane also. We have a regional office here, and they can provide the assistance as to the best agency within state government to be of assistance.
Thank you.
We don't get into the policing as much as a local government would. Often those are local matters, but we can get in to the other parts.
Yes, thank you. Senator Reed.
Well, we have lots of commissions both in Idaho and in Washington. Do you feel that these are really accessible and adequately known about by the people who need to reach them? What do you do, and how do you push commissions in order to make them truly effective? Sometimes politically they're apt to keep a low profile, and at the time when perhaps they should actually be being really marketed and talked about. What do you think, Carol?
That's a major problem. I suppose the best way to make them known and to make them effective is to properly fund them, and that's always the problem. There's never enough money to adequately do the complete job. I do think, however, that it is incumbent on state government to wherever possible, make the information available about agencies within state government that can assist victims, individuals who view that they've been discriminated against. That, again, is something that can be done through the executive offices. The governor often speaks to the issue of human rights and the role of the Human Rights Commission, and I think that's a critical piece. Other than that, I suppose there's 100 different ways you could do it, and no one's probably doing it adequately.
Well, you hit a real sore spot when you talk about funding. We have an old joke in Idaho that the legislature cares more about sheep and potatoes with their sheep commissions than they do about women in the Women's Commission, and it is always a problem. Bob, what do you think about human rights commissions on the local level? Have you given any thought to this, or has the council talked about a Spokane Human Rights Commission?
I think we're deficient in this regard. I think, just thinking as Carol was talking, so many commissions are filled with what we call token people, political appointees that are more or less dedicated to non-leadership rather than leadership. I think those commissions not only should exist, but their appointees, the leaders, particularly the chairman, should be aggressive leadership type of people that actually move quickly into the field in a very aggressive fashion. I don't think that we locally have done this adequately. We've had a tendency, I know, on the city council, and I notice the county commissioners, to refer things to a committee or to set up a quick committee and so on, but those committees have been generally non-controversial. They've come back with non-controversial recommendations. I think it should be the opposite. I think they should be an aggressive committee or commission or board, whatever it is, that come back aggressively and not try to smooth things over, which I think is often done.
Because you think the issues get swept under the carpet too many times?
I think very often.
And then they come back again in a more difficult
I think they very often
form.
get swept under the carpet, and sometimes they stay there for a good long time.
Mayor isn't apt to appoint somebody and say, come on forth and be a leader and be controversial. That's
Well,
government doesn't work that way.
No, she will and they will, and I think that that government responds to the needs of the people as expressed by other leaders, and I think that the elective office, in this case the council, the commissioners, so on, need encouragement in this regard from spokesmen of the people, calling in and talking, writing letters, and so forth.
Very good.
Jeanne Gibbons.
Carol told us about some of the political risks that a leader takes. Bob, do you think that the City Council of Spokane has taken any political risks in the area of human rights?
I can't recall any real risks that we've taken. We haven't had too much controversial proposals before us. We had things having to do with law enforcement. For instance, we had the controversy and the debate on what we call the loitering ordinance, which seemed necessary and was recommended by the chief of police as being a tool in the drug war. And I think we modified that and amended it. We added a sunset provision and so forth to see how it would work as a tool in fighting the distribution of drugs within the city of Spokane. I can't honestly remember in the last 2 or 3 years anything of a highly controversial nature in this field coming before the council. I think I'm not sure why that is true. I can't quite put my finger on it. Maybe somebody else can tell me. Maybe you can.
Do you see that as a plus or a minus?
I think it's a minus, yes.
I would like to also give you both an opportunity. We don't have too much time left, but we've been talking about the progress and laws and agencies that exist, and we've also addressed problems, and you've been very direct to do that. But both of you with lots of experience in this field now, for our viewers that are watching television, and we have an audience here in the studio, what would you suggest that we give top priority to right now in this whole field of human rights in both the city and county of Spokane and the state of Washington? If you were in a position to give a top priority and could prevail, what would you recommend? Carol, would you like to start?
That's difficult. One of the areas of concern that I see is that probably is one of the things we need to deal with. Whenever you have an emerging problem that people view as a crisis, there is a real risk of individual civil rights in an attempt to solve that problem. Two examples that come to mind very quickly is, one is the AIDS crisis. And where does a person's civil rights, how are a person's civil rights protected, and the public, and at the same time the public addresses the issue? You've got confidentiality questions, you've got basic civil rights questions that can get wrapped up and can get overlooked in an attempt to solve a major problem. The other area where this is occurring now that we have to be very careful of is in the area of drugs and fighting the war on drugs. Where does the issue of civil rights for the individual mesh with the issue of fighting the drug war? And it's going to be a debate.
It is. Bob?
My thoughts are almost exactly the same as Carol. At the city level, we deal with things on a day-to-day basis in great detail. We have a series of events that occur that we talk about and we react to. And we do have in every community, including the rural areas, the drug problem, the AIDS problem, and so forth. And we have community programs to take care of them. We have law enforcement policies and programs. And these have to be administered on a very fair basis. There's a danger in each of these programs, whether it's AIDS, whether it's drugs, whether it's just general law enforcement, whether it's community service programs, that human rights are not only ignored, they might be trampled on. And so you have to be vigilant. You must have these programs, but they must be administered vigilantly and with great fairness so that you don't actually add to the problem rather than solve it.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. I know we have other questions we could ask on behalf of the panel and our staff. We thank both of you for being with us. It's been most informative, and we look forward to continuing this series. Ladies and gentlemen, our guests have been Carol Gregory, who represented Governor Booth Gardner's office, and Councilman of the City of Spokane, Bob Delwo. We hope you've enjoyed this program and that you'll be with us again for 3 more weeks. Next week, we will talk with representatives of the area human rights groups. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at the same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by an NIC student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time. Welcome to today's broadcast of North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of NIC television students, and your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Welcome to our second week of a 4-week series entitled Understanding the Cultural and Ethnic Diversity of the Spokane Area People. Last week we dealt with a city and state official, and this week we wish to question 3 guests that we have from area human rights groups. We're going to talk about both the progress and the problems in the field of human rights. It's such a special privilege to welcome these 3 guests to our program. To my far left is Reverend John Olson, who is affiliated with the Christian Coalition, and he's also president of the Interstate Task Force on Human Relations. Welcome, John. Next to him, I'm very happy to welcome to the program Reverend Percy Happy Watkins, who is with the Ministers Alliance, and he's also a member of the NAACP. And Happy, it's a pleasure to have you on the program. And our third guest today is from the Native American community. He is known as a Native American cultural and educational leader and has written a lot of articles on this very important subject. Bobby Lake. Bobby, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. I'm happy to have back this week, and will be with us in this entire 4-week series, two panel members. To my immediate left is Idaho State Senator Mary Lou Reed, and next to her is former Idaho State Representative Jeanne Gibbons, and a member of the Coeur d'Alene tribe. And I want to also once again this week thank her so much. She has done most all the work in putting this program together. She is serving an internship through Whitworth College with our program. We're grateful for that, and we will invite Jeanne Gibbons to commence the questioning.
Thank you, Tony, and welcome to our program. As we all know, as I get to know human rights activists, I realize that this is an ongoing process, and it requires a lot of commitment. Would you all just briefly answer, what does it take for you to deal with human rights? What do you do to educate the public? The public is very uninformed about differences in culture, differences in races, differences, the special problems that people face in discrimination. What do you do to do your part? Go ahead, Reverend.
What do we do? Okay, that's a good question. I think our task force does some good things and has done a number of good things over the years. We came into existence largely in reaction to the Aryan Nation. We have attempted to be proactive as well and not simply be led by the Aryans and sort of caught up in that. I think there is a sense in which some people would think that if the Aryans were to leave, problems with racism and anti-Semitism would disappear. And of course that's a myth. They are an exaggerated, almost caricature of the hate movement, and there's a lot of racism going on, institutional racism and so forth, that need to be dealt with. And so in a general way, we have tried to respond in a proactive way with programs of education and so forth. We've also, in a sense, tried to bend history here in Spokane by getting the Civil Service Commission to change the hiring practices of the city of Spokane so that for the first time there were minority people on the police department, and our task force was the group that first raised that issue. And we got some help from the Ministerial Alliance and other groups to get that through, but that has marked a difference, and I think that so there is that kind of education that needs to take place too. And then there are well, there's a planning meeting in my office tomorrow with some people from the Kootenai County Task Force to try to plan a youth training event for high school youth that would plan for the future and train them so that we can start dealing with racism and anti-Semitism in a broader way, and not simply respond to the Aryans.
Right. Happy?
The Minister Alliance have a Speakers Bureau. We have found in the past years that it's one thing to preach in a church, but the real problems are outside the four walls of the church. We formed together to get involved. Now, in the past years, especially in the month of January and then Black History Month, we have been to a lot of the schools, elementary, junior high, and high schools, especially around the 15th, Martin Luther King's birthday. We go to different colleges speaking on human rights, and especially with the I Have a Dream. We get involved, like with John, when there was a lack of minority police officers. The ministers went down, and we went recruiting in the city of Moses Lake, Wenatchee, Yakima, Ellensburg, and Tri-Cities. So whatever the issue of the day is, we sit down, we formulate ideas and strategies, and then we go about trying to bring about some resolutions and solve problems.
Thank you. Bobby?
Well, I've been involved in, let's say, interracial concerns and discrimination issues and human rights issues from about the mid-1960s. Mostly noted in California, but going on a national level. Came up here, my wife and I came up here about 2 years ago. I'm half Indian and my wife is full-blood. And during those periods of times, we both put in a lot of time and energy working with Native communities, tribes, organizations, other ethnic groups, and other brothers and sisters, and with city and county governments and state governments, mostly through the areas of putting on conferences, workshops, seminars. I have approximately 36 publications in the field of Indian heritage and culture, and even at our own expense, we oftentimes Xerox these and just hand them out to people. It seems like it's a never-ending process. When I came up here to Spokane, and somewhat embarrassed to say this, but I felt like I'd stepped back 15 years in time. You know, you live in a place like California and work on the East Coast, and you make so many advancements, and then you move up here, and oh no, here we are all over again. You know, even to the point where my wife walks into a local store, I won't name it, you know, and as soon as we come in, this person starts following us around in the store, and it's so obvious. I mean, it's just like, here the Indians are, you better watch what they're doing, right? And my wife turned around and says, "You don't have to worry, I'm not going to steal anything just because I'm Indian. My husband's a professor," you know, little things like that to embarrass them because they made it look so obvious. Other techniques is just every time you come in contact with somebody to try to portray a positive image about your own people. You know, they have this stereotype that all Native American people are drunks. Of course, we're uneducated, we're savages and heathens, and there's all these John Wayne mentalities and stereotypes that we have to deal with. Tall, dark-skinned, big nose. Of course, I don't fit that stereotype. It might be nice if I did, but I'm a creator maybe the way I am for a reason. I grew up with the traditional people. I was taught and trained by 16 different hereditary medicine people from different tribes. I speak the language fairly fluently, participate in the sacred dances and ceremonies, and I carry on that part in my family with my children, and I share it a lot with our other people. Since we've been here, since we moved up here, we've had to change schools 3 times because my youngest son, who's darker, and his name is Windwolf, has had some really overt racist remarks directed at him personally to the point where it's affected him psychologically. He comes home crying. He says, "Daddy, I don't want to be Indian no more." I said, "What do you mean you don't want to be Indian no more?" "I want to cut off my hair. I don't want to be Indian anymore." The teacher makes fun of my name, and the kids laugh at me, and they don't like me here, "Daddy. I don't like it here." So what are you going to do about your skin color, son? You know, you can't change that. So we went through, coming off of the reservation from the city into this area, we went through a lot of cultural shock. All those California and New York and other places have large cities. There's a lot more interracial mixture. Here we found that the Native community stays pretty conservative, fairly isolated, really not that much even interaction with the other ethnic groups. We've begun to notice it. So in terms of answering your question in summation, every day of your life, if you're really conscientious, if you're proud about your heritage and culture like we are, every day of your life is an opportunity in a very tactful and I think humanistic way to change people's attitudes. It always comes up somewhere in a grocery store, in a bank, here, right in schools and classrooms, you name it.
We'll be talking more about the progress, and thank you all very much.
Mary Lou Reed.
Well, Bobby, that was a wonderful lead-in for my question, because my question really has to do with special Spokane-type bigotry. Is there a special Spokane type, or are there special problems? But let's hear from people who've been in Spokane longer first, and then see if you agree if they're with their assessment of Spokane variety. How do you describe the bigotry or the hate that is here? And how is it unique from other places? What are the real problems that Spokane should be addressing? How about you first, please?
I think it's a little more subtle in Spokane. Our Christian Coalition had an annual meeting where we discussed black and white problems in the community. And one minister, black minister, had said, "Well, there's no problem with being black in Spokane. It's wonderful." He said, "As long as you don't try to succeed." And so I think there is this kind of institutional racism that was, and the lack of blacks on a police department for years when there were blacks in Bellevue, for instance, is an indication of that kind of subtle institutional racism that that exists. And,
Subtle, but even almost more oppressive
well, I think so.
than continue, please.
Yeah, but that's not all we have. Recently, of course, we've had a number of incidents that have been embarrassing to everyone who cares about these things. Violence and malicious harassment. There was a 7-Eleven clerk, black, who was threatened by Nazi types in camouflage uniforms with swastika rings. There were the fire bombings in the cars owned by racially mixed couples. There was the Camp Chevrolet incident, which a black UPS driver drove up, and there was a burning cross, and workers in Klan outfits playing a joke supposedly on their buddy. There was the knifing, of course, of the black man by the skinheads.
And these incidents are on the increase.
This
right?
is not subtle anymore. You know, this is very obviously racist in tone. There is a gentleman here in Spokane who was a Klan member who was, I discovered fairly recently, is fairly big in the Klan. He goes in other parts of the country and speaks. A gentleman, I don't know if we can name him on this show, we might get into trouble, but he has his call this particular number for a message of hate daily. He has managed to get the Klan TV shows on the Cox Cable, the public access channel, and even made the news recently. Sort of, I thought, got too much publicity for showing them producing one of these shows at Cox Cable. They're starting to produce them locally, and I can think of another example too. There's a reverend on the north side, a white congregation, who has produced radio shows that are anti-Semitic in nature, and they are on 13 different stations around the country. It's very subtle, again, what is said, but when you write away for the materials, it's more blatant. And our task force did succeed in putting pressure on the station, and the Reverend himself didn't want to create a ruckus, so he removed the show from the air. He didn't want bad publicity, I guess. But it's here, obviously. It's not gone away.
Well, Happy, how would you respond to what you see as the unique problems in the Spokane area? Can you add to that?
Well, I came out of New York City, 1961, and I was in the Air Force doing boot camp. And they said Spokane, Washington, and I was happy because I thought that was right by D.C., Washington, D.C. When they told me the geographical location, I sat on the floor as a 19-year-old man, and I cried like a baby because they talked about Indians and teepees and bears and all of that. And it's a true story. I kid you not. Coming out here in '61, approximately 4,000 blacks out of a population of 186,000. I lived in one of the boroughs, which is the Bronx, and in the Bronx there's 1 million people, and out of that I believe 700,000 blacks. In Harlem, 1 million. So we don't have the numbers per se. I think that's, you could go all day when I came here in 1961. Today, what we face is a lack of communication. We still don't have the numbers. I believe the black population per se is around 4,500 to 5,000, give or take what happens on Fairchild Air Force Base. The problem that the Ministerial Alliance is facing right now, and we're on a couple of fronts, but the main thing we're focusing our emphasis on is youth. Of late, the thing about this thing about the Crips, the Bloods, if you're familiar with it.
Why don't you elaborate a little bit more?
Last year, some young men rode through Spokane. They were stopped by the police. They had an out-of-state license plate, California, the car, they traced the car back to California. It was involved in a drive-by incident. The two young men were from California, supposedly noted Crip members. Crip where blue, bloods were red. And from then on, it was said that they came here looking over Spokane. This was a right place for drugs. And it seemed as though that they went out and started recruiting. Well, when we got the message that the black community per se, they claimed there was 75 Crip members in Spokane. And we knew that was a real exaggeration. And so we've sat down with the police chief and the police intelligence and to make sure that that we can get exact numbers. We had to tell them that we, as blacks, we love peace. We want harmony. We want a fine quality of life for our boys and girls. And that's what we've been fighting. And it seems of late that every time a young man or a young woman get picked up, they're associated with the Crips and the Bloods. And so we've been fighting that real hard. Now, the city of Spokane sent myself and a Mr. Ivan Bush to Portland, Oregon. And there they have a real gang problem. And then I also went to Tacoma. There's a real gang problem, Tacoma. Those two I know about. And then I read about Seattle, of course, and then California, Anchorage. But if you ask my personal opinion, there's a few gang members in Spokane and some associations and some wannabes. It's like, I remember Superman, when he first came on the scene, faster than a flying bullet, more powerful than a locomotive. Okay, and he goes in a telephone booth and he comes out of his suit and he puts on his costume, but it's the cape. People emulate that. Young men were putting on capes and jumping off porches and breaking their arms. Same thing with Batman. What's the same thing with today? This movie called The Colors came out. It was the most disgracing movie I've ever seen in my life. But when people see it, they see realisms. And then they pick up the term like blood and brother and cousin. And if they see a person, Spokane now, see a person calling anybody brother, cousin, or blood, automatically associate them with gang members. We've been doing that all our lives.
Yeah. So that's just a false connection that is being made. And
yes, ma'am. And not to say that we're not naive, not to say that it can't happen in the Spokane, but we're saying that the numbers are too exaggerated, for once, and that everybody that gets picked up, okay, are not associated with gang members. And then they have a hard time classifying gangs with social clubs. 8 young men out of Rogers High School formed a club called the Schoolboys, and then they got associated with the gangs, and it was a terrible ordeal for them. Mm-hmm. So we've been fighting that.
Right. Bobby, do you want to respond to what they have said in terms of, as a newcomer to Spokane who's in the same field?
Sure. First of all, I thought it might be interesting to note I got a real close friend of mine who lived here for a long number of years named Sheldon. And one of the guys comes, "Hey, what's happening, blood?" And he looks at me and says, "How did you know?" He's a blood Indian. No new term. Sure, it might seem like I've only been here for a couple of years, but like I said, I've been very active in ethnic minority affairs, and particularly Native affairs. I think the biggest problem that most of our Native people face in this area comes in two ways. It can be overt racism, it could be covert racism, it could be very subtle, it could be very profound. It depends on the situation. For some of them who come up from the reservations, they have no money, they speak their own native language, they're used to the reservation way of life, they're faced with cultural shock and adaptation to a city life that's very harsh and very foreign to them, and end up on the street. And of course on the street, then they encounter probably problems from the local law enforcement and a number of other people, that they come across. The second variable, and that I feel very uncomfortable about in this area, and maybe I said that I felt like I jumped back in a cultural lag 15 years. It would really make my heart soar like a hawk, to quote Chief Dan George. If all the Native tribes got together here and then filed for an intense investigation through the Office of Civil Rights on discrimination in terms of employment and housing in this area, I think the facts speak for themselves. A quick analogy is when I came up here, I have 2 master's degrees in doctoral level work, and some of it was the background of social welfare. I applied for a job with the welfare department and took the test and everything else, and then found out that I wasn't qualified. When I went in and I challenged it, according to the minimum requirements, it just said you had to have a master's degree and X amount of experience in certain coursework. And I was more than qualified, but to make a long story short, when I went down and applied for the job, they said I wasn't qualified. So this typically what happens to a lot of Native people when this occurs, they'll just walk away, they'll drop it. But I'm a little bit feistier, and I've been involved in this for a long time. I felt I had the right to ask them why they felt that I wasn't qualified, and I did that, and I went down there, and come to find out that the man put that I didn't have enough education. See? I mean, that was just automatically weeding me out because I was an Indian. He assumed because I was Indian, I had more than the qualifications. I challenged it on it, and I even went to the Human Rights Commission, and I come to find out they had one Native American for the welfare department in the 6 county area. Where are the Indian teachers? Where are the Indian counselors in this area? The mayor says she likes to go in and sweat in our sacred sweat lodge ceremonies, but how come she don't have an Office of Native American Programs right up there in her front desk to deal with some of the crucial issues? Where are the Indians on the police force? Where are the Indians working for the power company? Where are the staff training for the teachers in this area? It's like a catch-22. On the one hand, they're treating our children with discrimination and racist remarks and everything, but on the other hand, they are not getting adequate preparation in the college. Junior college, community college, university level, do they have any ethnic studies courses? Do they have any Native American studies courses? Where are the people for our children to identify with and emulate to? Show me one Indian dean in this area. Show me one Indian vice president. Are there any blacks deans? Are there any Chicano deans? These types of discriminations, which people call subtle, to me are very overt. When my child is trying to learn to adapt in 2 worlds at the same time, to retain his Indian heritage and culture, but is forced to live in the white man's system, when he grows up, and luckily if he graduates from college, from high school, he's looking out there at the job market, and he's going to be looking for other Indian people. What does he have to identify with or emulate to? Or any of the Indian kids coming off the reservation? They're going to turn around and graduate and work for the tribal council? There's only so many slots. So I'm getting kind of excited here. Better shut up. The statistics are out there, you know.
We have about 4 minutes. Thank you very much, Bobby. I have a question. I want to start with Happy on this question. We've seen a lot of developments in this country in the last few years of increase in really overt violence, racism, and also directed at people because of their religion and many other factors. And one theory, and I'd like to get your reaction to that, is that leadership within communities and across the country, that if certain statements are made that leave the impression that we should slow down or take a step backwards, you know what I'm speaking to, that from those kind of announcements by leadership, that in itself encourages even more drastic steps by hate groups. Do you think that that has been a factor in the rise, and we see, of such activities as skinheads? What I'm really trying to get at is, doesn't a leadership of a country and a community have a moral obligation to speak in more firm terms so that those kind of impressions are not there?
Yeah, sure. And it takes people from the top, people that are in positions to make a difference, to speak out against such blatant statements. The one thing that bothers me about skinheads is their support that they get, and the sympathizers, and the fellow, where was it, that ran for a state senate office, ex-Ku Klux Klan member, and then when you look at the exposed contributions, what was in the South, yet a lot of his support, $10, $20, $30, came from out in this neighborhood. That kind of bothers me, and I think it bothers people in general to see that what keeps it alive is people who sympathize with people of this nature.
John, would you like to address that?
Yeah, I think we need to stand up and be counted. I think it's important that white people get involved too. I think sometimes we think the minority people are the only ones that ought to defend themselves when it comes to injustice, racial injustice, and I think that the white community, the majority community, needs to stick their necks out and be counted on and stand in support of the minority communities.
We have about a minute and a half, Bobby.
I like the analogy that Stokely Carmichael made years ago. He said, if you're not part of the solution, then you're definitely part of the problem. Once again, I feel that we've got different variables here. We're talking about discrimination and racism. Some are very overt, as in a gang situation, verbal hostilities, threatening people's homes and things of that nature, and there's a lot of documentation of this occurring to Native people down the Indian Center. But quickly, I think that affirmative action is a joke. Until we can start getting people, and they can't be non-Indian people or non-minority people because all the white people get most of the jobs. Until we get more sensitive and dedicated white people pushing for our ethnic minority people, and especially the Native people in this area, to get our people employment, to get them jobs, get them good educational training in the school systems from preschool all the way up to the university level. Let's see some Indian people on top management positions, which you don't see in this area. Just like myself, I apply for a job. They say affirmative action. They know what they tell me? Well, we hired a black.
I am so sorry to interrupt. I guess that's the signal we're out of time, and we'll continue off
visible,
afterwards.
or they hire a white woman because that's complies with affirmative action.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed our program. We thank our guests very, very much for being here. We will continue this important discussion. Next week, in our third program, we will be interviewing 2 victims of racism. I hope you'll be with us then. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at the same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by an NIC student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.